So it's August 18th, 2016. The moon is full, and it is between midnight and 3 a.m., depending on where you are, in the United States at least. This lecture deals with the concept of archetypal perception. And in addition, the perception of the world as various manifestations of spirit. In the ancient texts, we find an intimate relationship between the individual and the world around, where inanimate objects are perceived and interfaced as if they are beings in and of themselves. This spiritual worldview, animistic worldview, is core to the tradition and is really core to the understanding of how and why magic works. Even in trial records, we have evidence that sorcerers regarded their everyday objects as well as magical implements and animals, forces of nature, as persons. And offhand, what comes to mind is a scene from Disney's Fantasia where clearly Sorcerer Mickey's broomstick is indeed an individual and a person, and the method employed to affect that object was to interface with it, to treat it as though it were an individual, to command or communicate with it, empowering it, thereby empowering it with a persona. And this relates to previous lectures, for example, dealing with the genie, of course the familiar spirit, but the idea that we imbue an object with personhood in order to relate to it and to essentially sanctify it, to draw it into our universe, to recognize its presence in our universe. And this process empowers us to have control over our universe. We can easily relate to inanimate objects that have faces, things that remind us of ourselves. But we also see, particularly in folk tradition, the idea of addressing inanimate objects, everyday household items or natural items, as beings in and of themselves. And this is the animistic perspective, that everything is also a person. And I believe it was Joseph Campbell who touches on this, the difference between the thee-thou relationship, the idea that we do not have anything that is an it, but rather everything is an extension either of oneself or is a being in and of itself. And with that comes this demand for not only respect for our surroundings, but an attachment, an emotional connection with our surroundings, those objects that fill our surroundings. This is important from a magical standpoint, because this is how we bridge the gap between that which is within the self and what is out there beyond the self. What is out there can be cold and inanimate only if that is how we perceive it to be. It's also important to understand that the spirit of things that are otherwise inanimate are given personhood, are given spirit by our perception of them. A rock formation in the American desert that resembles a face or a type of animal only does so by the nature of our perception of it. In and of itself, it does not look like a bear or a buffalo or even a human face. It is our ability to perceive that it looks like a human face that imbues it with that presence. Therefore, if there were no humans to perceive it, it could not have the qualities that we perceive it to have. This is relative to a recent discussion in the forum about fairies. We have the human race and this extra immortal race that are interdependent on one another. It becomes the chicken and the egg, which came first. Are these spiritual beings shaped by our perceptions of ourselves that we transfer onto them, or are we the manifestation of their model, of their mold, model of the universe, the model for what is human, the model for what is good and what is beautiful, and that which we perceive as the positives of the human experience. However, we can't know the answer to this because it is a paradox that is inextricable. You cannot take one from the other without collapsing the other. If humanity were to cease to exist tomorrow, so too would this other race, and vice versa. If the other race were to cease to exist tomorrow, it means that humanity simultaneously has ceased to exist. And perhaps what we're really doing is we're peering at the surface of a lake. We can see beyond the surface, but immediately we see our own reflection reflected back at us on the surface of the lake. But beyond that, if we change our gaze, we can see slightly beneath that, perhaps to the bottom of the lake, and see that there is a world beyond that surface that is not part of this world, but it reflects our world. If we remove the reflection from the surface of the lake, well, the only reason to do that is to remove the lake itself. And therefore you can't remove the reflection of the lake without destroying the lake, and vice versa. And that may be one way to regard the fairy world, because this is apparently a subject that some students are having difficulty understanding. Animistic perspective, archetypal perspective is very important, and we have a capacity to imbue particular objects with that spirit when those objects remind us of ourselves. And so things that are like us are attractive to us. They say that people look like their dogs. And the truth of it is, people select the breed of dog because what looks symmetrical and attractive and cute to that person is based very much on their own symmetry, physical symmetry. So it's not that people necessarily grow to look like their dogs over time. They make choices about the breed of dog that they want to live with, and that choice is very often based on how it reflects ourselves. So you'll very often see that people choose dogs that are very much like themselves. If you look into, in fact, something I'm very involved in, for example, is robotics. And you're going to see over the next several, not even years, over the next several months, many companies are coming forward with robots that can be used in the home, but more importantly, and perhaps more significantly, robots that interact with people as if they were people. And this seems to be where the market appeal is. People want robots that are interactive. They don't necessarily want a robot that will clean their house. What they want is a robot that they can interact with in ways that we can't interact with our cell phone in ways we can't interact with our computer or even our television set. And if you take all of those objects, those devices, and wrap them together in one, this is, in truth, what the robot encompasses beyond its humanoid shell. It's no different from those appliances, but we have difficulty interfacing with those appliances as an individual. It's very hard to look at a smartphone and believe that it's actually a being. It's just a slate of glass, even though it can talk. If you're into Windows, then you have Cortana, who talks immensely better than the iPhone's Siri. And while they both talk, we don't regard them as individuals, do we? But if they looked like us, perhaps we would, and perhaps we'd talk to these devices more often. We would imbue these devices with some emotion. We would regard them with some emotion. And this is something that companies, particularly Japan Sharp, for example, the Sharp Electronics company now has a cell phone in the shape of a small robot that you can talk to. And you can tell it, do this, do that, and it will give you a cute voice in response, only in Japanese. And it becomes your buddy, your friend, and it's cute, and it's adorable, and it's more than just, I forgot my phone. It's, oh, my friend comes with me where I go. And the reasoning behind this is that it's very hard for us to make a connection with an object unless the object reminds us of us. And so you'll see these new robots coming out aimed at hobbyists and children particularly, but also at businesses. Many businesses now are obtaining these robots. One particularly that I am starting to develop for. You'll see it at probably high-tech stores at first, but also at places like Target and Walmart, where they're starting to take on some aspects of what humans do in those environments, particularly for customer orientation, product orientation, and so forth, even if for nothing more than just the wow factor or the cute factor. And this is significant because if anyone has ever had a pet rock, you understand that in order to have a pet rock, you have to imbue the pet rock with some degree of emotion, with some degree of persona, before we can consider it a pet rock. This is often done by gluing googly eyes to the pet rock, and now it reminds us of us. If everything in our environment reminded us of us, perhaps we would interface with it differently than we tend to when it does not remind us of us. If it seems inanimate or trivial or obscure, it is an object, it's a thing. But give it qualities that remind us of ourselves, it's a being. And it was easier for our ancestors to make this leap of perception, particularly when our tribal ancestors, going back far enough, you were likely to know fewer fellow humans than you were everything else in the universe. And therefore, human contact was very specific and very much a fragment or a fraction of the human experience. Everything else in the human experience was the environment, that which surrounds us. And so a relationship with the environment becomes necessary. So from this perception of the universe around us as existing of beings rather than things, trees begin to take on personalities. And we ascribe them personalities. Natural currents and forces take on personalities that we ascribe them. Jehovah, the thunder god, or El, the thunder god of the Bible, is very Zeus-like. He's very masculine and powerful and jealous and dominant and domineering because it's, after all, thunder. And we ascribe that presence to that phenomenon based on our experience of existence. Reminds us of the thundering father figure. Everything that we perceive at any given time is filtered through our human perception, the things that define what we are, even at a biological level. And so we collect things that reflect the parts of ourselves, the aspects of our experience that we feel we should emphasize. So looking around my museum of a home, I have statuary. Of course, the statuary that I invest in reflects what I hope to model myself after, or at least perhaps invite into my life. So I have naturally the Buddha. I have some models of Krishna and Lakshmi. I have statuary from everywhere. Ganesh, Tinkerbell, a fairy figure, more Ganesh, Radha, Krishna's spouse, who collects artwork, statuary that reminds them of the worst aspects of the human experience. We tend to seek out the positives, the hopefulness of human experience, and tend to want to relate to that. So art is an example. And when art reminds us of ourselves, when it is humanoid or at least a mammalian, we relate to it. We can grow emotional attachments to it, and this is important. In the old trial records we have witches talking to their animals, talking to their magical implements, talking to the broom, talking to the spoon, talking to the cauldron, talking to the teapot. All of these things are alive in animistic thought, in the archetypal mind. These things are alive. They're not things, that they are just like other people. They are beings with which we relate, and they can be categorized according to any division of categories you can come up with. But when we think of a teapot, for example, it is about water and containing, and perhaps has feminine qualities to it, as opposed to perhaps a knife or a broom. And we can look at a broom and think phallic, but we can also think it has the subtle curves of the female form. And so we each take our own filters to the task, and we perceive these objects in such a way. And this was important to magic, to our ancestors. It's still, the animistic way of thinking is still important in many magical traditions in the world, surviving today. But it's one that in the West we tend to forget because of that division between that which is important, meaning alive, sentient, and then those things that are not important, alive, sentient. Since I was 14 years old, I had an obsession with radio control cars, the good ones, the hobby grade ones, the ones you could race, the ones that people, make money actually racing. And 30 years later, I had the opportunity to buy one that I could never have had when I was 14 years old. And it's a being to me. I was finally able to obtain it. It's in my living room. I display it with pride. I put it together. I built it. It's called a shelf queen because how dare I would never dare take it out and damage it. But it takes me back to a simpler time. But it's not just that object to me. It has a soul, a spirit. It's much like a pet, really. This is a phenomenon that in Japanese culture has been identified as mo. In Japanese art, pop art, whether it be hentai, anime, people tend to form very strong emotions toward fictional characters of art and or in TV shows and movies. Very strong emotional attachments. When we look at the nature of these characters, they remind us of us, but they're also cute. They are caricatures of the most attractive qualities of humanity in simplified form, so they speak very deeply to the subconscious. And the Japanese term invented for this phenomenon of developing a crush, so to speak, on a non-person has been arbitrarily called mo, which relates to sort of like something like puppy love. And in Asian culture, this is not a huge leap, because Asian culture stems from an animistic worldview, from Taoism particularly, where everything has a spirit. And so if an object or a character is created, it therefore has a spirit. And it is a person, a being with which we can interact with our imaginations. Astronomical thinking, astrological thinking, expanding our awareness to not only what we perceive immediately before us, but also into the sky, into the heavens, into being aware of what is going on overhead, up there, in the blue sky of day, in the dark of night, in the multitude of objects that we see in the night sky, being aware of their motion and be sort of reconnecting with the fact that that whole world is there. That is the lake that bears our reflection, but it's a lake up there, not the lake down here. And so when we look into this lake of the sky, we see it through the lens and filter of ourselves. And just this is thinking astronomically. And then we think astronomically in the sense that there is meaning for what we perceive. So by expanding our awareness the way the ancients did, we get this broader sense of who we are in relation to what is out there. And then we can ascribe being, spirit, to what is out there, and then perhaps try to interpret what that all means. I've said before that having an astrological outlook through the use of horary astrology is very important, because it forces one to have an awareness of that archetypal thinking, that grander thinking of what's going on out there. It changes the way we think. It changes everything when we think astrologically. It changes everything about perception. It's like being aware of the weather. I want to plan my day. I need to know if I need a sweater or an umbrella or boots. What do I need? And only a fool would venture outside without a thought as to what the weather might be. To think astrologically is to do the same. And people have said to me and mentioned in the forum they don't understand that if magic is indeed a thing, why would astrology have any bearing on that? And the answer is simply, magic or not, some days it rains. Magic or not, some days you'll need sunblock or a hat or sunglasses. And this is the weather. And it's the weather here. There's weather out there as well. And horary astrology, hourary is another way to pronounce it. Astrology is to get a sense of what the weather is like out there, the spiritual weather. This does not imply natal astrology, which is popular astrology, which has no influence bearing on magic whatsoever. It's considered a pseudoscience, even within pseudosciences. In other words, we give no credence to natal astrology, because it defies the convention of magic that you can change things, change your stars. If natal astrology had any meaning whatsoever, then one could not change one's stars. But hourary or horary astrology predates natal astrology by tens of centuries, and understand that when we say astrology, we're not thinking probably what you're thinking initially. Natal astrology, which is popular astrology with the 12 signs, and if you were born under this sign, it means this. Absolute nonsense, even among those who already understood horary astrology. It comes up in the late Middle Ages as a scam, as a fraud, as an ability to make a product of astrology and sell it to someone who could afford to pay for it. And it's really not a part of a legitimate spiritual practice, period. And anyone who is an astrologer who believes in natal astrology, I have to just say, sorry, that has no place here. I can't emphasize that enough. But I digress. The idea here is that the magical mindset is in reading our environment and doing so in a way that it speaks to us. Are we listening to what it says? whether we call it animistic or archetypal perception, we're always, always, always in this process of archetypal perception. Everything we perceive with our eyes and our waking consciousness gets filed away under conscious thinking, but all the while our subconscious and or unconscious mind is perceiving things slightly differently. Rather than the details of what's going on around you, rather than the details of the color of the walls and the pattern of the carpet, the lighting of an environment or a room, the subconscious mind is interpreting that in very general, broad ways. And these general, broad interpretations of the details of what we're seeing, in other words, the non-detail of an environment, of an experience, involve the emotions that are present, involve all of those abstractions of the environment itself, the lighting, all rolled into a general, just a general feeling, a general perception, a general abstraction of everything at once. And so when we dream, we have that. We often dream the abstraction of this world, and it can be argued that the entire premise of the spiritual world is merely the subconscious mind's perception of what's going on in the conscious world. I have, over the last year, personally, frequently had both dreams and flashes of insight, flashes of these archetypal, these animistic versions, dreamlike abstractions of the environment that I'm in now. So the dream world itself, for example, is not particularly identical to the place that I'm occupying. But the place that I'm occupying triggers a memory, perhaps a dream, or the subconscious mind's perception of the environment that I'm in. And they are almost two different worlds, but they share a common template. Meditation tends to bring this mode of perception out. And so the world itself, the dream world, the dream version, and I use the term dream loosely, but let's say this abstract version of our perception of a particular given time and place it encompasses the emotion, the general prevailing thoughts, worries, fears of that general point of our lives when this memory is being recorded. And so it seems that the mind records both the details of the conscious mind's perception, but also sort of distills that into these more vague but all-inclusive terms and stores it in the subconscious. We very often dream that way. That, in my opinion, is the nature of the spirit world for every given place. It's an abstraction, it is subtle, it has the qualities of what we perceive in the physical world, but not the detail. And so we create our surroundings to provide us comfort and warmth. If we take, for example, an old dilapidated house, one that the neighborhood children would never dare enter because it looks so haunted and it's been abandoned for so long. It's just a foreboding place that no one would dare visit. And we enter and it's uninsulated and it's cold and it smells funny and just not a comfortable place to be. We've decided this is where we're going to live and we're going to make it comfortable. So what do? We gut it, we modernize it, we paint it, and before long it is not the same place that it was. It is the same place, but it's not the same as it was. The very spirit of the place has changed, has transformed. And all we've really done is cosmetics. Because what creates the spirit of that place is our perception of the place. I used to go for a very long period of my life, I was involved in paranormal investigation, and I will tell anyone who is interested in paranormal investigation, if you believe there's any evidence for the paranormal, scientific evidence for the paranormal, you're an idiot. There is none, and perhaps there can't be. But it took a very, very long time for me to really come to the conclusion that this is the case, and I tried. It's not because I didn't try. I really tried, and I'd love for there to be scientific evidence of the paranormal, but the bottom line is there can't be, and that's okay. But where I'm going with this is that in all of these investigations that I had gone on, the environment itself lent itself to a haunting. The environment said, haunted. It never looked unhaunted. It always looked haunted. It always felt haunted. There was always some cosmetic lean toward weirdness. It was always a place that made the body and the mind uneasy. And one was a very famous restaurant in Pennsylvania that had been maintained in its form for nearly 200 years and felt haunted as all hell. The smells, the sights, very ancient and antique. And I believed for a very long time this place is the most paranormal place I've ever been. And then it was sold and remodeled and turned into something like a Fuddruckers, or I don't know. And here it is, the same space. Cosmetic changes only. It's no longer as haunted, is it? It's completely unhaunted. It doesn't feel haunted because the perception of age and antiquity, the things that draw our minds down into that deep stairwell, are gone. The triggers are gone. And so the spirit of the place has changed. Now you can argue whether or not this is really just psychology or if we really can change the spirit of a thing by altering its appearance. But the definition of magic has always been that you can cause change to occur in reality by causing change to its appearance. Sympathetic magic is the idea that, for example, the quote-unquote voodoo doll affects the subject by mimicking its presence, mimicking its nature, mimicking its qualities. It is cosmetic, and if we make changes to it cosmetically, then it affects the reality, whatever the subject of that implement is, affects it. This is how magic has always been done. The idea that when we change a perception, we change a greater reality. This is very, very important. We must change our perception. So a lot of magic is about just cosmetics. Just cosmetics. Change the appearance, change the what seems to be into what it is desired to be. Well, that's the definition of magic, is it not? And the spirit of the thing changes. This is sympathetic magic. So even if we can take a small model of a place or an idea or a thought or a situation and alter that small model, change its spirit, the perception of the situation, place, whatever, person, then we affect change on the larger scale. This is the difference, and I'll relate this back to thinking about what's in our immediate environment versus thinking astrologically what's out there in the greater scope of environment. So the voodoo doll representing the immediate scale, and then the astrological representing sort of the mark, the person, the subject that we're trying to affect. We need that mindset all around in order to affect magic so that we're not limited to those objects, those walls that immediately surround us at all times. Those are our barriers, and they are cosmetic. One of the most disgusting places I'd ever been is one year I worked, when I was young, I worked for a temporary job at one of the early Halloween shops when someone finally got the idea that you could actually have a seasonal store and you could sell just Halloween crap to people for a month. People will buy this. And they offered me a ridiculous amount of money to do it, and I, of course, took it and managed it. And it was located in an old nursery, a building of an old nursery. When I say nursery, I mean plants and such. And it had been abandoned, building had been abandoned for 10 years, and its back section, its non-customer section, was old concrete and cinder block, and one broken out window, and of course the electric doesn't function in there, and it was moldy and musty, and it felt like a dungeon in a Dungeons and Dragons game. It was the most foreboding place I'd ever been. It moved me at my core to enter this side of the building. It was absolutely horrid. But it was just cinder block, concrete, and mold, and low light, cosmetic. And that building had been leveled, and another building, probably a bank, put on top of it. I believe it was a bank. And same space, same place. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful structure. It's beautiful indoors. It's beautiful outdoors. Changed the spirit of the place. There was nothing foreboding about the place, but the perception of the cosmetics. I'm not sure why I'm kind of going down that path right now, but my point being is that the idea that if we want to borrow from our environment, if we want to lean on the implied energy or power or meaning, perhaps is a better word, symbology, meaning of something that we bring into our lives, whether it be an implement that we intend to use for magic, an ingredient, a statue, whatever, then we sort of have to form that bond with it, don't we? Among my statuary, there's also Mojo Jojo from the Powerpuff Girls, and he came out of a Happy Meal toy, but he's Mojo Jojo. He's the evil monkey. He talks really cool, and he's cool and cute, and he's Mojo Jojo, and he has found his way among my statuary because I relate to Mojo Jojo. So these are the things we surround ourselves with, and Mojo to me is a guy. He's not that little piece of a McDonald's toy with a battery inside that lights up his skull. He's the monkey, the evil one. It's easy to make that connection with art, but we need to have that connection with things beyond that. Americans are very good with doing this with their cars. They form a bond with this machine. And it's not just about what the machine can do for them. It's about how it looks. It's about its style. It's about its color. It's about how it makes them feel. It's a very sensual relationship with cars. The original Corvette Stingray was based on the shape of a mature woman's body. That's not a mistake. It has hips. It has breasts. It's a hot car. Corvette Stingray. We relate to things that remind us of the best of the human experience we wish to have. This needs to be expanded to the environment as a whole, that everything is something. So I find myself talking to the screwdriver. I find myself cursing at the lamp. I find myself engaged with an object as thou. And this is important if we want the object to cooperate. For example, putting together 9-piece cubbyhole shelves that just don't want to cooperate. We had to have a talk. The shelves got built. But this is mundane. The idea that I'm trying to convey is that of relating to our environment as thou, as an extension of ourselves. Everything in our environment is an extension of ourselves. Everything that exists we perceive through the filter of who we are, and therefore nothing that exists is not a part of ourselves. Everything we see, the light reflecting off the objects in the room, comes into our eyes through the filter of ourselves, and therefore is a reflection, a extension of who we are. We see nothing that is not filtered through the perceptions of our psyche. The universe reflects your face and its surface. You are then the universe, and if should you cease to exist, so far as you know, so does the universe. Certainly, if the universe ceases to exist, you're out of there. This relationship between what is us and what is not us is important to bridge for the magical mindset. It's important to bridge that relationship and understand that everything out there exists to us because we can perceive it, and we'll only perceive it through the filter of our perceptions. So, the next time you pick up a pen to sign a paper or a check, think about what is the spirit, what is the nature, what is the person of this object? Who is this pen? What is its nature? When you interface with your appliances, give them faces, give them personalities. Let them speak to you. And we build then a better capacity to abstract our reality. And by abstracting our reality and thinking of and perceiving the universe, perceiving our situations the way the subconscious does, we get that broader picture of what's really going on instead of being focused on this particular illness or financial situation or family situation or whatever, which is very particular, very razor-sharp, pinpoint aspect of the totality of our world. We think more generally, and we start to have that dream sense of what this moment in time is like from all perspectives. What is the lighting? What is the space? What is the environment? What is the weather? What is our mentality? What is our mood? What are those forces and objects that are at work around us which we could not know through our five senses, which we can only interpret when we start to see this abstraction, this broad sense of what's going on. We can learn to see and reflect on that. That is thinking astrologically. Then we see the forces at work that we perhaps did not understand are influencing us. And then we can interface with those forces, strike a deal. So I hope that is somewhat helpful, particularly to new students, but also students that have been present for some time, because I feel that it will give you an opportunity to reflect in that way on objects, and particularly objects that you lend meaning to. Consider why and what you gain from doing so. And then reflect back on our ancestors who gave names to objects. The chair, the table, the kitchen sink. And if you look at trial records, our ancestors were considered lunatics because this is how they saw the world. And it wasn't just because they were from some tradition. These are people that, the witches, those who were interviewed during trial records, and explain things. This is John, my mortar, and Bill, my pestle, and the cat's name is Long Tom, and the fireplace is Nick, and all of these things in the environment. And of course the typical inquisitor is saying that they're mad, they're insane. These are inanimate objects. They talk to their broom, they talk to the pet, they talk to the door stool, they talk to the door frame, they talk to the walls, the ceiling, everything. They're in the fields talking to the grass. These people aren't right. It's a matter of a difference in perception. But you will see it in the trial records that it is very specifically discussed that these people perceived these objects around them as animate, even though they may not be. And this is important because the world springs to life. You are suddenly surrounded by beings rather than stuff. One is never alone, surrounded by anything that can be considered to have a spirit. I hate to use this reference, but because it's used so often and I believe overused, but children. And I've read many a Llewellyn book that likes to refer to the super intelligence of children. I'm not I'm not ascribing children with any degree of superiority in their intelligence, because obviously they're children. There's nothing particularly special about children over non-children. But the brain, the mind, and the mentality of a child, a young child, is one that the world is alive, that the big comfy couch has a spirit. It is a being. Enough that they made a TV show of that title. That the toilet, the garage, all of these objects that they encounter, not the least of which are their toys, have spirits, are beings with which they interrelate. And then as a child ages and learns language and communication, and understands that language and communication must be reciprocated, then the focus falls away from those objects of their surrounding toward beings that do communicate, humans and pets and so forth. But initially, it's all alive. It's all... no one is defined for this even infant, what exactly is what. And so, as a child begins to walk, they really see the world as just a series of critters and creatures and beings which with they interface. And this is not a bad way to see the world when we hope to have as much control over that world as possible. Beyond that, I can't express the value in this way of thinking. There are no words for the depth of meaning that I'm trying to get to. It simply must be experienced. Begin with things like a flame. A flame is alive. It seems to be alive. It does everything a living being does, and it's a very easy place to begin to see the world as alive. With that, it's very possible that I combine 2 lectures into one. And if I haven't, another lecture will be recorded shortly. Good evening.